Hi everyone, thank you for coming back to the second part of our Wan Hai Hotel program today. What you've just seen on the screen is a film called Moving Target by the artist Sung Tieu. And before introducing Sun to the stage, I would like to just refresh everybody a little bit about our program today, Wan Hai Hotel. So this is the program that we organized monthly in conjunction with the Wan Hai Hotel exhibition downstairs and also artist Ringden Johnson's exhibition upstairs. And for people who just came from the fourth floor, the performance by Aaron Cholai, this is a connective work that is continuing the inquiry into the question of militarization and also tourism. So the film that you just saw from Sun is an inquiry into a syndrome that is called the Havana syndrome, and the footage was simulated in this hotel in Cuba, which apparently the syndrome was first arising in the very hotel. So without further ado, I'll introduce Sun with some biographical parameter. Sung Tieu is a Berlin-based artist whose multidisciplinary practice encompasses sculpture, drawing, text, sound, and video. Her exhibitions critically examine the evolving structures and mechanisms of control, addressing questions of equality, belonging, and individual sovereignty, while exposing the psychological impacts of ideological systems and the politics that they produce. By interweaving extensive research with autobiographical elements, Sun bridges the personal and the institutional, investigating how power operates through the design of objects, spaces, and bureaucratic processes. Her work interrogates how contemporary systems of governance and globalization shape individual agency, often highlighting the tension between conformity and resistance within these frameworks. Sun's most recent solo exhibition include 1992 that just opened at KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin last week. And she's got another solo exhibition coming up this year at Kunsthalle Bern. And also in 2024, she had a solo exhibition in Kunstmuseum Winterthur in Switzerland, MIT Lister Visual Arts Center in Cambridge, United States. And her work has also been featured in major international exhibitions, including the 15th Gwangju Biennial in 2024, the 14th Shanghai Biennial in 2023, and the 34th Biennial in Sao Paulo. And welcome, Sun.
Oh, yes, hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. The last film got cut off. I think the last 3 minutes were missing, but anyway, you saw most of it. I want to jump into this presentation by perhaps showing you the span of my practice. So there's going to be a hard cut from this film to the next project, and then I'll try and work out how these two are interlinked. But we're jumping to the next slide. I think I maybe can... Oh yeah, okay. We're jumping to a different building. So the film you've seen is from a project from 2021 about the Hotel Nacional de Cuba in Havana. And I now want to take you somewhere else for a minute, and then we'll come back to the hotel later. But I've been self-organizing guided tours through a different building. The building is located on Gerenseestraße in the suburbs of Berlin. It's sort of like a 30-minute train. a tram ride from Berlin Alexanderplatz, the center of the city. And this is the housing complex. The housing complex was sort of like built in 1980. So the planning for the building started in 1977, and the construction sort of finished around 1980 with the first workers moving in there. So we're talking about Germany and Germany in the GDR. The German, I don't know whether you're familiar with the GDR, but anyway, so basically my father came as a contract worker to the GDR in 1987, and this housing site was one of the largest housing complexes for Vietnamese contract workers that came to the GDR from the 1980s onwards. And I personally lived in this housing complex from 1994, so after Germany's reunification. But what I started doing, just actually out of a self-impulse and through actually an Instagram post, was to offer guided tours to this housing complex. It's been standing empty since 2002. And it sort of became a site of speculation for, Berlin's gentrification, pretty much. It has been in private hands since the collapse of the GDR. It got transferred to the Treuhand, and ever since, it's been sold from one developer to the next. And currently, it's sort of in the hands of Belle Epoque, a developer that, actually wants to demolish these buildings, and those buildings were set to be demolished actually last year, but they are still standing. And I basically started to ask the developers whether I could give guided tours about the history of this building. Because, well, for one, the buildings are built in the concrete slat format that Honecker basically popularized in the 70s and 80s. So essentially, cheap housing, as you can see maybe in the back, with prefabricated concrete slats that you bring to the site, and then it's almost like a Lego system where you connect those concrete walls together to essentially build these rooms. I lived there in 1994 when the housing complex was actually the heart of the Vietnamese community. And the Vietnamese community and how it emerged in the GDR was essentially through those recruitment contracts that the GDR sort of signed with their so-called brother countries. So among them is not only Vietnam, but also Mozambique, Angola, for instance, and Cuba. But the Vietnamese population was by far the largest of those contract workers that came to the GDR. So we're talking around 60,000 to 65,000 contract workers that came in the span of 1980 until the collapse of the GDR. And this housing complex, located in the suburbs of Berlin, was one of its largest. It had approximately 1,000 rooms, and in those 1,000 rooms, during GDR times, there lived around 4,000 people. So you have to imagine in a square meter size of 16 square meters, you had around 4 workers living at the time. And these tours that I've provided to my guests sort of talk about the living conditions of those contract workers at the time. There were very harsh rules as to how they could live there. For one, women and men were separated on different floors because the GDR sort of like tried to avoid, different sexes and genders mingling with each other. One of their biggest concerns was, for instance, that women, would start, or couples would start love affairs, but women to get pregnant. And one unwritten rule, for instance, about the GDR and this recruitment agreement was that you had a limited contract, oftentimes signed for 5 years with a possible extension of another 2 years, but after that you had to leave the country. So abortion was an unwritten rule that wasn't allowed. It wasn't clearly stated on the contract, but if you were to get pregnant, you were asked either to have an abortion or to leave the country. So one of the ways to quote-unquote prevent people from meeting was to either house women and men in different buildings or to divide them on different floors. I think here you can perhaps also see the structures. So the way these rooms work is that you would have, six to 7 story buildings, and each of them had only one kitchen on one end of the corridor and either 1 or 2 bathroom facilities on each floor. So a lot of people obviously would share those facilities. And oftentimes those housing complexes were placed, strategically next to the factories. So for instance, the contract workers that lived in those buildings worked for state-owned enterprises nearby. Some of them were in the meat processing factory, others worked for the transportation services of the GDR. There was Revatex, a textile company that people were working for. And yes, so I sort of got interested in the history of this building actually, through my personal research, but also, of course, through me living in this building from 1994 to 1997, when this building was actually a site for a lot of far-right violence against migrant and foreign workers after Germany's reunification. And that became increasingly more urgent when I realized that those buildings are going to be demolished. And so I started essentially offering tours to the site. With sort of like the collapse of the GDR, all those former contract workers essentially lost their jobs in 1989 and 1990, and sort of like a legal gray zone emerged out of the collapse of the GDR. The newly reunified Germany didn't know what to do with those contract workers. So for a time span until 1993, those former contract workers were left in a very uncertain state. For one, it wasn't sure whether they had the right to work, what would happen to their resident status, and also whether they should be deported. So Germany, for instance, offered 3,000 Deutschmark for Vietnamese contract workers to leave the country. And many of those contract workers took on the offer, while others decided that they wanted to stay in Germany. Because leaving the country first meant that even in Vietnam, their work status was uncertain, because Vietnam at the time was also in a precarious place. But also they sort of took on financial burden to go to Germany, to take on the travel, and they were hoping, with working in Germany, they could sort of like save up money, bring it back to the country, and also, support their families at home. So, around 2/3 of those 60,000 Vietnamese contract workers decided to return to Vietnam, but 1/3 decided to stay. So my father was one of those contract workers that decided to remain. And it emerged that in the first few years, until actually 1997, when the final law got passed that former East German contract workers would have the same rights as to West Germany's Gastarbeiter, that legal status, went through various stages of uncertainties. But because of that, the Gehrenseestraße really became a site for, far-right violence. So even famously, the New York Times wrote an article in 1995 titled "No Jobs, No Country" about the state of Gehrenseestraße and how it became, for one, a hub for the Vietnamese community to self-organize and, fight, a resistance fight. And on the other, how exactly that conglomeration of a lot of Vietnamese people became a site for, a lot of anguish and insecurity for the rest of the population and the neighborhood. Here you see images of how the building state is right now. There are temporary inhabitants, occupying the space or living here. And, for me, those tours are, on the one hand, about sort of recalling my personal memories with the building, obviously as a child of 7 years old who lived there. But then, on the other hand, it was more about really contextualizing actually the meaning and the importance of Gehrenseestraße for the city of Berlin and, actually Germany's wider history, which I think is really under-acknowledged even until today. So, jumping, okay. So jumping from this project to contextualizing back moving target shadow detection, the video that you've just seen in the beginning. I think this will all make a little bit more sense at the end, but I just want to perhaps show you my approach to work, because it sort of has different facets. On the one hand, I'm really interested in my personal biography and personal histories that I interweave into work, and then on the other hand, I have this almost schizophrenic desire to leave that all behind and deal with subject matter that has nothing to do with my own biography. And moving target shadow detection and the research surrounding Havana syndrome is one of those incidents that veers more far away from my personal experiences. But I think, it'll come back. So Introspector was an exhibition at Amount Foundation in New York that opened in 2023. And it weaves together two different research projects, one surrounding Havana syndrome and the other titled Liability Infrastructure, that looks more into actually hydraulic fracturing and the North Brooklyn pipeline that was extended around Aman Foundation while I was working on the exhibition. So in Aman Foundation itself is sort of like separated into 3 buildings, and for my exhibition I was able to occupy 2 of the buildings. And in the first, exhibition site, you encounter research around Havana syndrome, and again, the film you've seen. And the film is sort of like a 3D animation of Havana syndrome. So I was actually supposed to travel to Cuba, but then COVID occurred, and that wasn't possible. So what I did with my team was to essentially reconstruct Havana syndrome and the entire building based on archival images, but also TripAdvisor reviews of the current state of the Hotel Nacional de Cuba that is still in operation and that you can still visit, and you can still, book a room and a holiday there. But for the purpose of this video, we reconstructed everything in 3D. And I sort of have this nano drone fly inside the model, inside the 3D model of the hotel, to then capture the images that you've seen as a film. So this nano drone sort of like flies from the lobby up the elevator into the 6th floor, where supposedly in one of the rooms on the 6th floor, the first incidence of Havana syndrome occurred. Havana syndrome, for those of you that don't know what it is, it's sort of like a set of symptoms that, the US eventually coined Havana syndrome based on obviously the first incident of Havana syndrome in Havana in the Hotel Nacional de Cuba that occurred end of 2016 and affected mostly CIA and embassy staff that were stationed in Havana. And the set of symptoms comprises nausea, headache, vomiting, tinnitus, but also more severe damages such as supposedly brain concussions in the victims. I sort of started to hear about Havana syndrome in 2017 and was interested in the phenomenon because even until today, Havana syndrome itself can't be proven. It's sort of a set of illnesses that we all, don't know the source of it yet. Supposedly, it was caused by a sonic attack. So a sonic weapon that somehow we can't quite grasp, we don't even know exactly how it sounds like, has caused those set of, illnesses in the victims. Initially, it was, speculated that it was a sound weapon. Later, perhaps it was a frequency weapon or an audioacoustic weapon, but it remains unproven. And I sort of became interested in Havana syndrome because, for one, I was researching on other sonic weapons. During the war in Vietnam, for instance, famously, there was a psychological weapon that surfaced as a sound weapon titled Ghost Tape Number 10. Ghost Tape Number 10 is a tape that PSYOPs, the psychological operations of the US Army, produced in the 1960s to scare off Vietnamese soldiers and trying to psychologically manipulate them to give up the war and to sort of go home. But that connection to Vietnam was of interest to me, and in this exhibition, I'm sort of like bridging these two, sets of research. So on the wall in the back, you see brain scans of my brain under the MRI scanner that I recorded while listening to the reconstruction of Havana syndrome that was released in court meetings in the United States to prove that Havana syndrome is real. And one of the sound recordings that they released was, a quote-unquote high-pitched cricket noise that, the court described it as such sound. And I got hold of that recording and exposed myself to that recording while at the same time recording my brain under the MRI scanner. So so there's sort of like this direct connection between the film, but and the brain of the artist in this case, listening to the reconstruction of Havana syndrome. When you enter the second room, I sort of have these TV screens on the walls that function almost like outdoor display screens that depict different newspaper articles that I wrote. They are in so far fiction as, of course, the writing, is made by me, but they are all based on real facts, those newspaper articles. And they sort of lay out my research on the one hand on Havana syndrome, but on the other hand on ghost tape number 10. And, how these two sonic weapons, one made by the United States against, Vietnamese soldiers, for the war in Vietnam, and on the other hand, a sonic weapon that was produced to harm, CIA and embassy staff in, in the different countries where they were stationed, essentially. I think one interesting fact that I came across while researching on Havana syndrome, but also on the war in Vietnam, is about these helicopter landing mats. I mean, it goes quite far talking about that now, but I just want to mention that essentially those helicopter landing mats that were produced for the war in Vietnam to land heavy vehicles on the grounds, on monsoon land in Vietnam, where after the war ended, were recycled. Most of those fencing for those landing mats either returned to the United States, or they actually never left the country because they were in storage units. But those were then recycled to build large sections of the US-Mexico border wall. So for me, sort of like the continuation of the war in Vietnam, as a site happens now somewhere else, which is at the border site between the United States and Mexico. And, one of those news screens talk exactly about that, about those landing mats that were used and then recycled. So, just more images from the I think I skipped a few. I'm not quite sure how to use this. Okay. Right. I hope you can follow. Am I a bit too fast? Oh. No, it's good. Okay. So, Aman Foundation sort of, like I said, bridges two parts of, two parts of an exhibition. And in the second part, I was more curious about my immediate surrounding around Aman Foundation. and the North Brooklyn pipeline that was supposed to get extended in the neighborhood. And what I did for this project was to create these signages that you actually find in Germany everywhere, but that aren't immediately accessible in the same way in the United States, which is to indicate where various different pipelines are in your surrounding. So, you know, this one says gas, and it sort of indicates to you that from where your body is standing, you know, the next gas pipeline is 300 feet behind you. So while I was visiting Amman, I found all those construction sites that were open, and I could see that National Grid, a British company, was trying to extend the North Brooklyn pipeline to connect that gas pipeline to existing gas infrastructure. And I started to ask myself, first of all, how that happened. And I also quickly learned that there were small local protests in the area to fight actually against the extension of the North Brooklyn pipeline in the area. That had to do with various reasons. For one, National Grid charges the cost of building the pipeline to the local residents by just increasing the gas bill, of the houses around. And for other, of course, there's an ongoing conversation around fracking, hydraulic fracturing that is taking place in the United States, where essentially, gas is being extracted from shale gas formations that are, quite close to the surface to extract liquid, quote unquote, national gas. So I think the slides, hold on. Here. These slides show you exactly the gas pipeline infrastructure that is in the United States and where they try to essentially extend the pipeline. So my museum that I work with, the Amman Foundation, was sort of like, I think, in phase 4 of the extension. Yeah. And so what I did for the exhibition was, for one, install those 4 different plaques around the museum for people to understand where the next gas pipeline is in their proximity. And on the other hand, I made this, I'm going to get back to those works, but this is sort of like the center installation at Amman Foundation, where you have, these 3 pipes sticking out of the wall that we sort of like inserted into the wall, and it housed a sound installation of those 3 pipelines, but the sound itself is sort of field recording that I took at different fracking sites in the United States, 1 in West Virginia and 2 in Pennsylvania, where I essentially traveled to those fracking sites, and I recorded the vibration of the soil at those fracking sites. So what I did is I used a LOM. It's called a LOM phone, but it's essentially a, complex contact microphone that you can sort of stick into different material matter. In my case, that was soil, and record minute vibrational changes as sound waves, as vibrations. So this is sort of what you hear in those pipes. I think I have, oh yeah. This is one of those recordings that you can hear while you're in in the museum. Um, oh, sorry, I don't. Yeah, I'm skipping the other two channels, but yeah. So at the heart of the research for this part of the exhibition was this mural titled "Mural for America," and it consists of 1,920 plaques. And what I did for this project was to work with a data scientist, Gary Allison, and a physicist, Dusty Horvitz, to condense down the different chemicals used in fracking. What we did is we worked with Frack Focus, and Frack Focus is a website that is, publicly accessible. I would urge you all to go and look at this website. But Frack Focus has sort of around 2 million usable entries. I mean, there are more than 2 million entries on the website, but of those entries, there are around 2 million that are usable and understandable. And essentially, Frack Focus is a website where the different fracking companies in the United States are obliged to submit the chemical data of all the chemicals they are using within the hydraulic fracturing process. And what I did with Gary Allison, a data scientist that also works for an NGO titled Frack Tracker, who track sort of accidents that happen around fracking sites, was to distill those 2 million entries down to the individual chemicals that are used in fracking. So in the end, we came up with 1,920 that are used over and over again, in different recipes to frack. And out of the 1,920 entries that you see here, there's around 15% of proprietary ingredients. So trade secret ingredients where no scientist, no public person, not even politicians really have access to it because they're protected under trade secret law of the various companies. So again, in those 15% of those trade secret companies, there could be 1,000 chemicals. There could be, 10,000 of chemicals. We don't know because it is impossible to actually research those singular chemicals. But the attempt to sort of make this mural, which is a living mural, that could change when laws change and we would receive more information about the trade secret ingredients that are currently now inaccessible, that mural would also change and more information would be sort of added to this mural. But here you can already see actually the complexities of the chemicals on show and how difficult it is actually to track those chemicals as well, for instance, in groundwater. Because we don't even have, the testing kits to test for all those chemicals that are used in fracking. What is also really interesting is those fracking companies continue to release new chemicals. And by releasing new chemicals, they actually force scientists and researchers to again look into those chemicals And that just delays the entire process of accountability for those companies to be accountable and environmentally, for the damages they cause. Here's just a screenshot from Frac Focus, the website. You can actually click onto the various different wells and look exactly into, which company is operating, in that county, and which chemicals they are using. So this is kind of all public information, but because there is a flood of information, there's so many entries that it is truly, really difficult to research, those various operations. This is a slide from Frac Tracker, the NGO that I mentioned, with whom I worked to sort of look into the different, accidents that Frac Tracker is tracking surrounding those fracking sites. But also you see, for instance, here on this slide, all the wells in West Virginia with PTFE or Teflon. Teflon is one of the chemicals that you can't decompose, and it's highly toxic and in very small amounts cancerous. So Frac Tracker also tracks all those chemicals in all the different states. If you ever were to be interested to research this on your own. Sorry, I don't know. This is, I think my slides are, I don't know whether I'm using this correctly. But part of the installation is also this fictional news article that is sort of like a project that follows me around in my practice. But this specific article actually talks about the medium of journalism itself. It's titled "There's Green Gas in Ohio State," and actually talks about the Friday news dump. So the Friday news dump is a phenomenon that happens within journalism, is when you have unpopular news that you don't want the public to know about, and you want as least fraction as possible. Then you release that information on a Friday afternoon when all journalists have already left the office, went into the went into the break, the weekend break or holiday or whatever. So journalists wouldn't pick up that news. And such incidents was about green gas in Ohio, where basically the state governor of Ohio released a bill where he would classify fracking in the same category as renewable energy, because he argued that quote-unquote fracking is green because it is natural to extract gas from the earth. And so they would have sort of the same benefits as renewable energy. Investment benefits, subsidies, tax breaks for those companies that would frack. Exactly. I'm just going to check the time. Okay. Yes, so maybe already you can see that my practice is quite, I would say, it veers off into different directions. And in this work, I'm sort of like just collecting different waters that I've been using, drinking, or in the rivers that I encountered while I was traveling to the different fracking sites. And that work is actually juxtaposed across these 3 documents that you saw. I'm not sure I added the slide after this. I think it's, sorry, it's somewhere before, but it's, you know, it's sort of like hung across the wall of a 3-wall document where a resident was complaining about the water quality, you know, of the drinking water they were receiving in their home. And they basically asked the Environmental Protection Agency to test the water. And clearly, you know, there were toxins in the water, but the government in the end didn't do anything about it, pretty much. So maybe to connect back to the theme of you know, today's talks, militarization and tourism, I'm really trying to perhaps, you know, show you on the one hand, you know, Havana syndrome that clearly happened in a hotel, you know, to the housing complex where I used to live that then became a site for guided tours, which, you know, also clearly, you know, links to the idea of visiting or touring to those various sites, to this project around hydraulic fracturing that actually talks about, you know, how energy, our energy sources, you know, are, you know, being extracted, but then also obviously being consumed, and how I think in an earlier slide you could see that most of the fracking happens on the east coast of the United States, on the west coast of the United States, and being transported, you know, to the big cities on the east coast, and how actually those sites of fracking aren't be seen in the cities where they are then being used. I have prepared a lot of more slides. I think I can maybe have another 15 minutes to expand further on Ghost Date number 10 that I already have mentioned. Yes, maybe 5 minutes on Ghost Date number 10, and then I want to show you some more off-site projects that I've been doing in Berlin. But yeah, so I think I've already mentioned Ghost Date number 10. Ghost Date number 10 was part of a bigger psychological operation that, you know, PsyOps sort of researched and executed in Vietnam, you know, during the Vietnam War. This is basically a research image that you see of a soldier carrying 6 speakers on their backs, and they essentially would just go into the forest and play, you know, this recording that they made titled Ghost Tape number 10. And Ghost Tape number 10, this is an image of the headquarters of PsyOps in Saigon, the 6th Battalion of the Psychological Operations of the US Army. This is an archival image of the tape that I found in the archives. And what the United States did is they hired voice actors, Vietnamese voice actors. They had a text originally in English that they would translate into Vietnamese and have those voice actors read the text. The text essentially is about a man who's a dead, supposedly a dead Vietnamese soldier that is wandering the earth as a ghost, as a soul. And he would cry for his wife and his children from the afterlife and would, you know, call them, and he would say that he died a senseless death in war, that he doesn't know where he is. He's asking where his wife is, where his children are. And the conclusion in the end is that he calls to his friends who are still alive, so other Vietnamese soldiers. He would say, "My friends, if you're still alive, please go home. Go home. You know, I died a senseless death in war. Please go home." And it's sort of based on a deep Vietnamese spiritual belief that when you die and your body won't be buried, with a traditional ceremony, that your soul is sort of going to wander restlessly, on earth. And so, the US Army, took that spiritual belief and turned the use, against the Vietnamese population itself. And on this slide, you basically see how they attached speakers to the outside of helicopters and would sort of play the tape at night while flying the helicopter above, the forest. And based on those archival images, I made these news articles that I started in 2017 that would sort of like summarize those events. The first articles, especially this one, was actually written with American journalists because I sort of like tried to recreate the voice of a male American journalist from the time and how they would perhaps write about these articles. So these works were made in collaboration with Vincent Bervins, an American journalist that was working for the Washington Post at the time. So these 3 articles were from an exhibition in Hanoi, and they would sort of connect different spiritual beliefs and how they were used, during the war in Vietnam, and how essentially the US military used, those touristic sites. For example, the Black Virgin Mountain is a tourist site in Vietnam where actually young couples would mecca to the Black Virgin in hope, for instance, if you were hoping to have a child, you would mecca there to pray for the Black Virgin. She died. She died because she was deeply in love with a Chinese soldier actually, and her love wasn't returned, and she killed herself on the mountain. And young couples in Vietnam would still today mecca to this site to pray for her and for this, love that wasn't returned. So, to give her peace and to give her rest. But, for PSYOPs, for the psychological operations of for the US Army, those narratives and stories became highly interesting because they wanted to exactly use those narratives to then use that as a psychological weapon against the own population in Vietnam. Yes, I could either end here and we slowly move to questions, or I can show you a few more slides. Yeah? Okay. I think I have a lot prepared. I think I'm going to jump a few slides. I'm not going to talk about them. I hope you don't mind, because it goes quite far. Inco print is basically, very quickly I'm going to jump through it, but Inco print summarizes that research around Ghost State number 10 and Havana syndrome in this exhibition, where I basically made an exhibition with 2 iterations. So these are the 2 iterations. I basically changed like the fencing structure of the 2 iterations. And in the first part of the exhibition, I only showed evidence that Havana syndrome was real and true. And on the second part of the iteration, I only showed information that was doubting the existence of Havana syndrome, that only showed informational evidence that sort of disproved Havana syndrome as a phenomenon. So the way we conceived the exhibition was to not announce the change of iteration. So the public actually didn't know that there were two different versions to this exhibition. Just half time, I think the exhibition was open for 3 months, and after 6 weeks, we just changed the information on the new screens and changed the way people walked around the fencing structure in the exhibition without announcement. Yeah, it's quite a lot of information. Okay, I'm just gonna walk you through it. So, Inco Print had another sound installation. It was sort of like a sound installation that was hidden within six sort of fabric sculptures that were placed around the room. So, I mean, it's quite a long sound work, but I think I can maybe tell you a bit about it. So, the sound work itself consists of 5 different channels that would incorporate different parts of the research. One sound channel actually played my brain waves reacting to the reconstruction of Havana syndrome. So you would, hear my brain activity while listening to Havana syndrome. On the other hand, it would play the reconstruction of Havana syndrome that I found in court meetings itself, but also linked actually to the structure of the museum. So I also recorded the pipeline infrastructure of the museum, as that was supposedly one way of how Havana syndrome was released, was through the pipeline infrastructure, like the ventilation shafts, the radiators, into the various rooms of, for instance, the hotel rooms in the Hotel Nacional de Cuba. That's why also in the film you see sort of the smoke, slowly filling the hotel room, and then, filling it with something like gas or air. It's sort of like undescribed smoke that you see. But in this exhibition from 2020, I'm sort of like connecting these 2 different evidences. This iteration, the first iteration you see here, I'm only presenting information that is affirmative of Havana syndrome, and that Havana syndrome was real. It is sort of based on scientific research and evidence that was released, in various news articles, but also by scientists that, that researched on the brain damages that occurred in the various victims that have experienced Havana syndrome. So this first article actually deals with the brain concussions that were supposedly found in victims of, Canadian and embassy staff that were stationed not only in Havana, but also across the globe. So Havana syndrome actually started in Havana, but there were instances of Havana syndrome even in China. There were cases in Hanoi. We had cases in Berlin, in Paris, in Vienna. So Havana syndrome has sort of like occupied the entire globe. And until today, there's still, US intelligence trying to find the source of Havana syndrome. But sort of like in this exhibition, I'm laying out information around, the evidence that proves Havana syndrome is true, with basically the political consequences that Trump drew at the time while he was still in office, to sort of like close the US embassy in Havana. Which also followed with further political restrictions and, that really harmed the relationship between Cuba and the United States. And within the exhibition, on the right hand, you see research around Havana syndrome, and on the left hand, it already links Havana syndrome, the sonic attack, to the one in Vietnam, where I'm sort of like laying out information around PSYOPs and its psychological use of, Ghost in number 10 as a sound weapon against Vietnamese soldiers. So, also this comparison between, for one, the United States, making a sonic attack and then being the recipient of a sonic attack. So how also, military technology has traveled, and, for one, I think what was so scandalous about Havana syndrome was that it was one of the first incidences where the private homes of, CIA staff was attacked. So, a side that wasn't usually, this side of war, right? It's not the common side where you expect militarization. So I think I have one, yeah. So in this slide, I'm sort of like laying out what I already mentioned to you. You actually see here on the right hand these helicopter landing mats that I already mentioned, that were produced to land heavy vehicles. I think here on this slide, you can also see those landing mats that then again returned vertical. This is the U.S.-Mexico border wall, where those landing mats were recycled and remain until today. So if you ever were to visit the U.S.-Mexico border wall, perhaps in some sections, very certainly you will find them, but perhaps you would visit exactly that section where those landing mats are placed. And I sort of like became interested for this exhibition in actually the visual affinities between something like those helicopter landing mats, but also the work of art. So in this context, I'm referencing Sol LeWitt and his wall drawings. Because I wrote this, I read this interesting essay by Victoria Hattem, where she talks about the visual affinities between those helicopter landing mats and also art. So, here I'm sort of like comparing the helicopter landing mats with a drawing by Agnes Martin. And I'm sort of like transporting, that language also to the clothing. Let me see. So here, these are the brain scans. But I hope I'm trying to show. Yeah, you see in the back corner one of those bags. These are sort of like all military clothing that I repurposed. So I removed the initial fabric and replaced them with grid fabric. Just to quickly show you the second iteration of encode print. Here, the fencing structure got moved, and the new screens suddenly turn red, and I'm actually only showing evidence that speaks against Havana syndrome, or that doubts the existence of Havana syndrome. Because I guess like one of the main points of contention was also that the United States accused Havana, but at large Russia, to be behind the sonic attacks. So it was also, a continuation of a sort of Cold War or a geopolitical war that happened, and Havana syndrome was, the site where that occurred. So, if you listen and read research on Havana syndrome from the side of Cuba, where they also conducted studies on Havana syndrome, they just say it's not real, it's not true, that never happened. No one can really make a sonic weapon that nobody can hear. So there are also a lot of scientists that I spoke to, sound scientists, that say so far we can't prove that there's ever been a sound that can penetrate the ear in such a way that can cause brain concussions in its victims entirely through sound. So this iteration sort of like lays out doubt on Havana syndrome and questions more, also the geopolitical intentions that the United States might have to pursue such a political, driven narrative around those attacks. It was actually quite difficult to make this exhibition in 2020 when Havana syndrome was a real existing threat. To show evidence that was sort of against Havana syndrome was, quite difficult. But interestingly enough, like in 2023, when I showed the work at Amman Foundation, around the same time, there were 5 independent intelligence agencies that were researching Havana syndrome, and all of them concluded that it was very unlikely that it was a foreign force causing Havana syndrome. So they all cast doubt on the existence of Havana syndrome. So, for me, releasing information about the doubt, questioning Havana syndrome itself, suddenly became validated through US intelligence. But again, like in 2024 and 2025, there has been again new incidences of Havana syndrome, and again, it's still surfacing. If you are ever interested in researching it, it has come to life again. Yes, I think I maybe want to end this presentation with returning back to the guided tours I've been giving and linking it to the histories I've been exploring surrounding my Vietnamese community in Berlin. So one of my earliest projects was, around Vietnamese-owned flower shops in various different subway stations in Berlin. So, as I already mentioned, with Germany's reunification in 1990, all those former Vietnamese contract workers that came, as labor force to the GDR lost their jobs and were left in this legal gray zone. And one of the, earliest things they did was to try and find other forms of employment. That form of employment, had to be, related sort of to what they could do. They couldn't suddenly become doctors or lawyers or things like that, but they could open small businesses, informal businesses, without licensing. So many Vietnamese contract workers decided to just buy flowers, and initially they would just stand with buckets of water and flowers at subway stations. And then over the years, they emerged into flower shops. Why subway stations or S-Bahn, train stations? Because basically the Vietnamese community and, those flower shop sellers expected to have immediate customers through people commuting from A to B so there was a high flux of people that potentially could buy those flowers. And these informal flower shops then over the years turned into real flower shops. And you can still visit those flower shops until today. So this one, for example, is at the subway station Zoologischer Garten. And what I did for this project was very simple. I had no money at the time. So, I just self-funded this project by making a sweater. It was a printed sweater that Nick Cosmos, an artist, did the graphics for. And it just says in Vietnamese, truth, beauty, and friendship. And in order to buy one of those sweaters, you had to engage with the owners of the flower shop. They were sort of like sold behind the counter. And my friend Duong and I, we released, a press release where we would talk about the emergence of those flower shops in the various subway stations. And we would encourage each visitor to go talk to the owners about, how these individual flower shops, came to be. And then, alongside buy a sweater. But, the sweater functioned more like a medium through which you, could get in touch and be in conversation with the people. And these are just images of the opening, where you can already see flower, buyers and, sweatshirt buyers mingling together. Here you see the subway, and on the left-hand side is the flower shop. So, the way I started making exhibitions was actually, always initiated off-site. I didn't have a museum interested in my work. So what I did is I just tried to find exhibition spaces myself, or venues I think could be interesting. So the flower shops were one of those venues. And the next projects I did in this Vietnamese shopping mall. It's a shopping mall not far away from Gernseystraße, the housing complex that I showed you. It's sort of like a 20-minute walk from the housing complex to the Don Son Center. And the Don Son Center is sort of like the biggest shopping mall of the Vietnamese community in Germany. It consists of like 6 huge halls where you have various different sellers selling, from food to clothing to LEDs to import-export shops, with electronic products. But I essentially asked To from Keko LED, who sells LEDs, lamps, and lighting, whether I could reprogram the various LEDs in his shop. So you had sort of like this running LED slides that usually would just, talk about how much, a laundry, for a laundry shop, or, how much cleaning a pair of pants would be, like maybe, €1 for cleaning this and that. But I basically asked him whether I could reprogram all the LEDs to list all the various different recruitment agreements that the GDR and West Germany have signed with all the foreign countries to bring foreign labor to Germany. I think I also mixed it with different immigration to the United States and to other countries, but the main focus was sort of on recruitment agreements to Germany. So here, you sort of like just see the slide of those state agreements that would bring, the migrant community to Germany. And I mean, this exhibition also happened in 2015 at a time when there was a growing sentiment against migrants. So 2015 was actually the time of the Syrian crisis, and Germany experienced like a flood of migration, which came with a growing, hatred and resentment against, refugees and migrants. So in the midst of that, I actually wanted to remind the German population of the various recruitment agreements when they actually needed labor, when immigration was quote unquote welcomed, and how that sentiment so quickly changes with the political changes of the country. Yeah, so these were all the LEDs. And so the exhibition would also move and change. Every time, Toe, the owner, would sell an LED, another LED would come out with a different, recruitment agreement. So, this exhibition was moving actually all the time. And by the end, I also reprogrammed all the LEDs in storage. And once all the LEDs were sold, the exhibition would sort of end because there were no signs anymore. Parallel to this, I also occupied the space in a different shop. It's an import-export shop from Bing Hua Import-Export. And I made an MP3 player for the shop. So this is sort of like a redesigned MP3 player that I made that had sort of sound work in the MP3. So you would basically buy the MP3 with a pre-programmed sound work of mine. It was like, I think we sold it for 20 euros. That was the production cost of what it cost me to sort of like reprogram and make the sign. On the left-hand side, you actually see the old MP3 player, and on the right-hand side, this sort of like redesigned MP3 player that you could buy with the sound work. And, I wanted the work to blend in perfectly, as if you wouldn't even know that it would be, a work of art that I made, but it would just fuse perfectly into the rest of the shop. But yeah, you could buy the MP3 and listen to the sound work. And the sound work is actually me going to KaDeWe. KaDeWe is a shopping mall in West Germany. It's called Kaufhaus des Westens. It's basically a shopping mall of the West. And, obviously we're in former East Germany right now. And Kaufhaus des Westens is, where all the luxury brands, sell their products. And I sort of like go to the perfume section of those luxury shopping in the luxury shopping mall and ask basically the staff to explain to me why the perfumes are so expensive, why this Dior perfume is so expensive, or this Armani product. And they would come up with elaborate descriptions of flowers from Damascus and, all the different ingredients they used to elevate and justify the price of those perfumes. While at the same time, in Bing & Hua's import-export, you could buy a counterfeit version of those Dior products. So it sort of also talks kind of about the class difference, of obviously the buyers that go to a Vietnamese shopping mall versus the buyers that go to buy, products in a luxury shopping mall in West Germany. But at the same time, it also questions, these cultural signifiers that would justify certain pricings, and also what is real, what is fake, what is counterfeit. I think that's a conversation that I'm sure you know a lot about, also here in China. How do you value those different goods? yeah, I think maybe I want to end here. And yeah.
We're opening questions to the floor now. Anyone would like to? Okay.
I really like your work, firstly, and yeah, I really appreciate your presentation. It's really amazing, and I was curious that at your like the last project, Havana, the Havana Symptom. Sorry, I forget the name, and I noticed you used the concrete, the structure that looks like a bit like the curls, and I was curious why you use that. Yeah,
yes.
like why you use that? For me, I always think it looks a bit like curls.
Yes.
It's more like a religion thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm using sort of like these, Christian-looking crosses, right? That's what you mean.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, part of the exhibition, I have these like, they're made of wood, but they have like a concrete finish to make them look like concrete crosses. And I came across those pillars actually in Sao Paulo, in a parking lot, where I found, pillars that had a concrete cross, which wasn't intended, I think,
Okay.
but it looked like, of course,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
an ideological symbol. And I wanted to transport that ideological symbol into the exhibition, because for me, Havana syndrome is also a manifestation of that, right? A manifestation of which narratives do you believe? Do you believe the American side that wants to prove Havana syndrome is real, or do you, believe in science, which is also tainted? Obviously, there are scientists on both sides of the matter. Scientists that think Havana syndrome really existed and brain concussions can be caused by sonic attacks, and scientists that say there is no such sound frequency or wave that can penetrate the ear in such way to cause brain concussions. So for me, it's also an ideological matter that surfaces when we think about Havana syndrome, and the cross somehow symbolizes, that for me, and that's why it's in the exhibition. Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, and I also would to ask you, do you have any suggestion if a place is really hard to talk about post-colonialism, if people in art still want to doing that, but maybe the place is hard to talk about. Do you have any suggestion like for that? If like one artist face some limitations.
You mean limitations in terms of access to information, or access to, or the ability to speak up?
Like to speak, like to speak the topic, like some topic, like
right. I mean, I think the beauty of art is you can kind of subvert what you want to talk about, or you can use all the different tools and mediums to connect it to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure whether that is helping you, but I feel like the power in art lies in making these creative bridges. So if you're talking about censorship right now, is that a topic that you're trying to address here? Or no?
I just like.
No?
Yeah. With your mic. Sorry.
有些的人会了解到，知道，比如说知道后殖民或者说殖民的概念，并不是很普及，然后后殖民的概念更不是很普及。当一个地方是，这样子的，然后就是在这种情况下，我们就如何再继续做相关的艺术活动，或者说，因为有时候 ，like 会觉得就是，比如说我去向别人解释后殖民是什么概念时候，可能说，大家有些人并不是很想了解这些主题，或者说，首先是不了解，然后了解后也不想继续去 talk about。当一个地方是这样子，更多情况下是这样子的话，那我们如何继续去做相关的艺术的这样子的 like talk or something else，或者
Oh yes, that's a very good question. I think it's a quite difficult one to answer because I would argue I think what is important is to kind of inspire people, right? In a way, I think what is interesting about art or the way we can transmit information is to sort of inspire people to engage with it. I guess, it's hard to force anyone to do anything, But maybe there's a potential in still persisting to do it, and I would urge you to persist, to continue. But I think what is interesting about art is that it is this sort of almost magical bridge through which you can speak to such a wide audience and allow them to access information in different ways that are not directly straightforward information, right? So I feel like that's, if you are an artist, that's still, perhaps the best medium. I mean, I have a body of work that actually looks into, more concretely into post-colonialism, especially in Vietnam. I don't know whether it's actually, I think it's not in this slide, so I don't think I can show you. But I think, the way colonialism manifests is still today. So even though, it talks about the past, in my case, I'm talking about, French colonization of Indochina and with it Vietnam. And, but there are still connections to that today. So one thing that I talk about in my work is actually the turn to the metric system. So in end of 1800, Paul Doumer introduced the metric system to Vietnam. So the former, governor of Indochina, the French governor of Indochina, basically abolished the traditional measurement units that were used in Vietnam at the time and imposed the metric system. For one, it was needed to be able to, quote unquote, measure and quantify, the sizes of land, to measure, different units of investment. But the metric system, as we think about it today, as something that is neutral, that is, being used universally all across the globe, in itself, wasn't at the time of, colonialism in Vietnam, because at that time it was very important to use that to open Vietnam to international trade and to global investment into the colonial project. And that happens through something as simple as changing to a metric system in order to be able to measure it. So, it's a long answer to not directly to your question, but I think maybe connecting it to current events and showing how they have continued and lasting impact until today is a way to engage the audience.
Yeah. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Yeah. And
Hi, thanks for your brilliant speech. And I have some follow-up questions. What's the first case you introduced? The recruitment workers working for the GDR. I want to know, like the original place your father lived in, Vietnam, and also other people signing a contract. Previously, the place where they live in Vietnam, are they mainly from the North Vietnam or the South Vietnam? Is that the historical background? Is it like highly relevant to the Cold War? Like, is it like a part of the communist, like a union to make the communist union large? Or are they mainly from the South, that they are the previous citizens of the so-called capitalist South, like as political refugees seeking for asylum in Germany? Thank you.
Yes, like you said, it was a socialist project, with the socialist brother countries that were affiliated to the GDR. So it was mostly Vietnamese people from North and Central Vietnam. But like you said, very much with that ideology in mind, to build a socialist system, which in reality didn't come true. The way they treated, foreign workers in the GDR was, I think below humane. Like, their restriction to reproductive rights, to sexuality, to a clear segregation of those workers from the rest of GDR society. Those housing complexes were intended to be close to the factories or, fenced off through a road, not like a direct fence, but through infrastructural decisions around those sites that would, in effect, segregate the people. People were also working in a 2 to 3 shift system, which meant that they were working all day and night. That would also limit, the way they could interact, with the rest of society. And then, of course, there were language barriers. Initially there were German classes for those contract workers that very quickly were limited to just 4 weeks. So the language barrier played a huge part as well in restricting the way they could move and live in the GDR.
Well, I have a question here. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It's really nice to hear you talk about your beginning of making the work, your beginning of your career as an artist and to sister, and it's really nice. My question is probably something that you've been confronted a lot over the years, I can imagine, but I think it's still interesting maybe for Chinese audience to hear your take on this. Because I think China is essentially still a homogeneous society, and we're just starting to embracing foreigners. But I think we cannot, we should all admit that we can already see signs of the conflict between foreigners and Chinese in very bad form. racism, so to speak, like the anti-blackness in Guangdong province in the south of China. But maybe it's something also, it's not only a so Chinese problem, but it's a different topic. But my question is actually about the current day crisis in Germany. Because I think we can all agree on that we're living again in a dividing world, sadly. And maybe Germany is just one extreme example where the immigration problems has started years ago since Arabic wars, and it is even more true now after the Ukraine war. And my question is, how do you see, could you share your thoughts on the current crisis in relation to your research, of the colonial history 30 years ago in Vietnam and the immigration problems? Yeah, just really curious what you think.
I just opened a show at KW in Berlin, Kunsthalle, and the title of the exhibition is 1990-22, 2025. And one of the incidences I look at in the exhibition is a case that occurred in 1992. So 1992 is the year when I came to Germany. But at the same time, a former Vietnamese contract worker got also killed by a member of the DVU, the Deutsche Volksunion, which is a, far-right extremist party of the time. He was killed by a sympathizer of the DVU in 1992 in Marzahn, which is not far from the housing complex and not far from the shopping mall. He got stabbed and eventually died in hospital of the consequences. And in 2023, I was invited to propose a commemoration sign for Nguyen Van Thu, for the contract worker. But within the competition, I was the only Vietnamese artist that was invited among 2 other German artists. And, I essentially spoke to the commission and said, look, I can't be the only Vietnamese artist. There's a problem here. You need to invite more members of the community, and I'm happy to propose other, Vietnamese German voices that could contribute to this commission. And, they came back and told me, no, we won't do that. This is the commission, that's it. And then I decided to bring on 6 of my collaborators to submit a proposal, under, quote, my name. But all we did is to criticize actually the structure of the jury, of the commission, And we said this is a problem, this is structural racism, especially when you actually want to commemorate, the death of a human that got, killed in a far-right violence. I'd argue that, perhaps, the German artists are not in the right position to do so. And essentially my collaborators and I got disqualified from the entire project for raising our concerns. And the commemoration sign went to a German artist, and it got built, and it exists. The problems that are happening in Germany have actually never left. Perhaps, the incidences from 1992 seem so far away, 30 years on. But when you look closely, they have always been there, and the voices of the far right have been stronger at times, sometimes less so, but they've never disappeared. Or, you know, the sudden eruption of the popularity of, for instance, parties like the AfD is something that's been growing over many decades. And I think now we really see very concretely the consequences of that. That is also due to other far-right parties across, you know, the United States and Europe, you know, and other parts of the world gaining popularity. But in Germany, it's taking very extreme, let's say, manifestations. It manifests in, you know, limitations to freedom of speech. It manifests in police violence. It manifests in restricting the languages that can be spoken at protests. And yes, it's something that I am grappling with, that I don't know exactly how to respond to yet. And the exhibition at KW is also a manifestation of, you know, the grappling of it, or with it. It's sort of, as part of the exhibition, I'm sort of making changes to the board of the museum. So one of the first works that I proposed for the exhibition was to put on new members to the board, to diversify the board, essentially. So I said to my curator that, you know, if I should do this show, then the first thing I want to do is to put another person on the board, and it's, you know, somebody that I'm proposing to represent the community. But, you know, it's a very small step along a longer path, but yeah.